Hey there, my wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. So as a wedding professional, my social media feeds are constantly flooded with weddings and wedding inspiration, and I wanted to do a video today talking about certain trends that are either trending currently or things that I have just seen on Instagram or Pinterest that maybe look really cool in photos and videos, but are a logistical nightmare, or just to give you kind of a wedding planner's personal opinion on certain trends that we're seeing on social media right now. So I see things on social media all the time where I get sent things that from friends that look really cool, and in my mind I'm just like, this would never work. So I thought it might be fun to do a video on some wedding trends and to get the perspective of a wedding planner, a wedding professional. Okay, so the first one is this style of reception dinner table setup. It looks very cool in this photo and video, but logistically would be the worst setup at a wedding dinner ceremony, especially if you plan on having any sort of toasts or if you have a larger guest count. As that kind of weaves its way through the woods there, the people at the very end are going to have absolutely no idea what is going on at the other end of the wedding table. And wherever you guys as a couple are kind of positioning yourselves, especially if you're on one end or the other, anywhere that's like 10, 15 people away are gonna have no idea what's going on, and they're only going to be able to chat to the people that are immediately next to them. In a smaller, more ballroom style setup, not even indoors necessarily, but when you have round tables all kind of around each other, or rectangle farm tables, you at least have the community of the other tables around you. Typically everything is somewhat central so that they can see you guys as a couple and see what's going on when there's toasts, cake cutting, whatever is happening during the reception, and be able to kind of feel a part of it. And in this particular setup, you're definitely going to have people that are going to feel like they're stuck in the middle of the woods. Not to mention the catering nightmare this would be. So the people at the very end it's going to take very long to serve them their meal, especially if this is plated. Even if it's not plated, if it's a buffet, having to walk all the way from the very end of that table to wherever the food's being set up is just an absolute nightmare. So looks really great in picture. Absolutely would not recommend doing this in real life unless you have a very intimate setup. Similarly, I saw this post kind of blow up somewhat recently, and again, it looks so cool in photos. Kind of the idea of it is pretty fun, and I think that it could be done. I think that you would absolutely have to let your guests know that your chairs are going to be in the water so that they can dress accordingly. I think that's number one. Obviously, if you're going to have chairs and tables in the water, shoes are not going to be an option, and making sure that attire is going to be above the knees. That being said, if a female is wearing a longer dress, and not even necessarily long enough that if they're standing in the water it would touch the water, but when you sit down, sometimes the fabric will drape over the chair, and that could be sitting in water as they sit down. Additionally, similarly to the other one, catering feels like a bit of a nightmare with this. If you've ever tried to walk through a pool or through the ocean or something, walking through water is not the easiest thing to do. And imagine doing that while serving plates, entrees, anything in your hands does not seem very conducive to efficient service. Not to mention, as you're walking through water, it splashes. And I don't think that's something that people thought about, because if you are barefoot and you don't have the clothing issue, then that's fine, walking through the water, sitting in the chair in the water, a little bit of water. But if you're getting up and moving at any point, you're probably gonna be splashing the people around you, and that just doesn't sound like that much fun to me for a wedding. 3 is a donut wall. So I don't really see this that much anymore, thankfully. This has always been a weird kind of peeve of mine at weddings, and I think it just comes from more of like a sanitary stance. So when you have a donut wall, that's likely going to be set up fairly early so that you have that like aesthetic when your guests are walking in and they can see that. And when you think about it, donuts don't have that long of a shelf life when they're, you know, exposed to the elements. So if you're sticking a donut on a wall in either outdoors, indoors, whatever, in kind of exposed air, they're gonna get stale kind of quick. And so it might look cool for a little bit, but your guests are probably not gonna want to eat a stale donut, right, after it's been out for a few hours. Not to mention, I don't think a lot of people think about the sanitary side of what they're hanging on. So people will build a donut wall with like nails or whatever. You're putting edible food onto a nail. That's probably not that sanitary. So just from a wedding planner side, the more logistic, practical side of me just says no to donut walls. Number 4 is a sparkler exit. I did a whole video on sparkler exits, so I'll definitely get into a lot more detail in that. If you want to hear more about that, I will link that above. Sparkler exits, I think maybe I'm just over it as a wedding planner. I've seen it so many times. It's not necessarily a bad trend. It's definitely doable. There's just so many little logistical things that can go wrong or that are just kind of a nuisance when it comes to doing this at a wedding that I kind of am just over it and think that we should move on to something different. For one, very difficult to rally people when everyone's wasted, and that's usually the point of the night that a sparkler exit happens, and it can take a really long time to get everyone organized. And you have the whole fire hazard of it all, or burning the couple as they're running through, like not really paying attention to where the sparkler is in reference to the person that's walking right by this fire. Additionally, it can be kind of difficult logistically with your photographer too. For a lot of couples, they have their photographer leaving earlier into the night once the reception gets going. And if you're doing a sparkler exit, that's typically happening at the very end of the night. And a big part of doing this is to have those really cool photos of the sparkler exits, which I get it. They look great. I love a good sparkler exit photo. But then that means you have to either pay for extra hours for your photographer or be shifting their time frame that they're photographing your wedding later, which means that you have less time earlier in the day for those photos, or you are doing a fake sparkler exit, which a lot of couples do choose to do so that they can get those photos before the photographer leaves. But then it kind of puts a pause on the whole momentum of your wedding reception, your dance floor, and DJs kind of hate this. So that's just kind of my little take on sparkler exits. And number 5, I have not had any couples express interest in this, and I really hope that they don't, because I find it so incredibly awkward. But I've been seeing this trending a little bit, and that is the ceremony chairs facing the aisle. And in theory, it sounds cool, and I think for the moment of walking down the aisle, it's cool. And then that's it. And then it's nothing but awkward, because you're either faced with dead on staring at the person directly across from the aisle from you, which is super awkward, or you're having to sit and crane your entire body to see the wedding ceremony for the duration of the wedding ceremony. So don't really know who started this or why it's trending. I would highly recommend not doing that. Okay, not all trends are bad though, and I don't want this to be a completely negative video. So I'm gonna talk about some of the things that I've seen that are trending that I actually really like as a wedding planner. First one, going straight off of the aisle facing chairs. This has been a little bit of a trend for a while, but I do actually really like the ceremony setups when they are slightly rounded, if your space allows for that. It just seems to give everybody a little bit of a better view of what's happening up at the altar. The only thing to keep in mind here is at the very front row, since you are being curved, you likely will need to have a pretty small amount of chairs in that front row if you are having a wedding party stand up at the front with you, because as they are standing across, you want to make sure that they're not standing right like at somebody's knees at their chair. So just keep that in mind. Number 2 is the private last dance. I am not sure who started this trend, where it came from, but it's really popped off in the last couple of years, and I actually really like this. There's not a lot of moments that you are getting with just your partner, and it's really nice to have this at the very end of the night to be able to really just like soak in everything and kind of process the entire day together and have this last moment be just the two of you. And if you do choose to do some sort of exit of some kind, the private last dance is a great way to kind of lead into that, as it gets everybody out of the space and serving a purpose somewhere else. And it makes it a lot easier for you guys to achieve this private last dance. Number 3, wedding content creators or wedding content creation in general. I will admit, I was maybe not very, but I was pretty anti this when it first started to kind of come on the wedding scene, and maybe that's just the millennial in me, but I just thought it was so unnecessary to be putting that much focus onto creating content for your wedding, because like that's not what your wedding is about, right? But I mean, we're getting professional photographers and videographers to document weddings, and with the insane rise of social media, it's pretty much just a given that people are going to want to be taking videos on their phones at your wedding, and having somebody or a group of people that are there professionally that are hired to do that, I think can be really great because you know that you're going to be getting this documentation and more behind the scenes stuff without feeling the pressure to have your own phone on you all the time, or your bridal party, your wedding party, or even your guests to be filming and documenting things in the moment. And will kind of bring everyone to be a little bit more present, but knowing that you're going to get that documentation more than just what your photographer can document, because they're pretty different kind of avenues and the documentation that they're getting and what they're capturing. Your photographer is going to have a very specific list of things that they are documenting and the way that they document it, whereas a content creator, again, is going to have a very specific kind of type of content that they are capturing, and the way that they do it is going to be a lot different than your photographer. Just make sure that if you do have a content creator at your wedding, they are not impeding on anything that your professional photographer or videographers are doing. And this shouldn't add on to your kind of content documentation photographed time. You want it to kind of be in tandem with what you already have scheduled for your photos and videos, because you're already getting pulled away so much for pictures for your wedding and for that kind of documentation, that you don't want this content creation to be an additional time that you are getting photos and videos taken, and more time taken away from your wedding, your cocktail hour, your wedding reception, and everything like that. So if you're able to do it in a way that is kind of in tandem with what's already happening, and making sure that they're just capturing kind of the wedding as a whole and as it's happening, and not creating extra moments and extra time to get just this content for social media. Number 4, audio guest books. This is something that I've seen a huge increase in the last year, and traditional guest books have been kind of slowing down quite a bit, and this was something that was pretty much just present at weddings because it was like what you're supposed to do. And how many people that have had a guest book, an actual physical guest book that guests just sign, how often are you looking at that? Probably hardly ever afterwards. And it's kind of fun to be able to have the audio side of it. So an audio guest book is where your guests can leave you a message on a phone, and then that's turned into a recording after the wedding, which maybe you won't sit down and listen to the recording all that often either, but it's nice to have that, especially if you have guests that you don't get to see very often, or if God forbid somebody passes away. Having the voice of somebody is so much more personal and special, I think, than having just like their name or a well wish written down into a book. I also find that guests use it a lot more and are more inclined to participate in your guest book if it's an audio style guest book than just a traditional signing of the guest book. And finally, champagne towers. Logistically, there is a lot that can go into this, but I do think it's a great trend. It's very fun. It always makes killer photos. What I recommend with champagne towers, however, is to not have one with the intention of serving your entire guest count, unless you have a pretty small wedding. That will require a lot of stability, a place to set up all of these glasses, somebody that's going to set up these glasses, somebody that's going to pour the glasses. Ideally, this is great to accomplish if you have somebody that can set that up for you, like a professional bartender, whoever that might be, and pour them and everything for you. And then maybe you guys as a couple are just pouring the last couple and not having to pour all of them, because there is kind of an art that goes into this, and it can actually be fairly tricky. So if you are doing a champagne tower, I recommend just doing it for your wedding party, or just for the photos, or for a small amount of people, just to have kind of the look and the moment of the champagne tower, and not try and serve your entire guest count with the champagne tower. Wedding inspiration and wedding content is so fun to look at and get inspiration for your own wedding. However, not everything that you see on Instagram or Pinterest should be deemed as something you should want to emulate. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.